This is a Film Stories original podcast.
Love this podcast? Support this show through the Acast supporter feature. It's up to you how much you give, and there's no regular commitment. Just hit the link in the show description to support now.
Hey, it's Mark Maron from WTF here to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. And I'm sure the reason you're listening to this podcast right now is because you chose it. Well, choose Progressive's Name Your Price tool, and you could find insurance options that fit your budget, so you can pick the best one for your situation. Who doesn't like choice? Try it at Progressive.com. And now, some legal info. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes per details.
Cue the fireplace and your favorite fall movie. There's nothing better than a cozy evening at home with a glass of First Leaf wine. First Leaf is a personalized wine club that delivers right to your door. Sounds magical, right? They get to know your favorite tasting notes, which varietals you enjoy, and whether you prefer sweet or dry wines. So in every shipment, you get bottles tailored to your unique palate. Go to tryfirstleaf.com/fall to get your first 6 wines for just $44.95 with free shipping.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody, welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale, and today I'm going to be talking to Jonathan Rigby, who is a historian, a writer, an actor, producer and a consultant on many documentaries. His area of expertise, I would say, is horror movies. He's written a series of wonderful books, English Gothic, American Gothic and Euro Gothic, and is currently working on the second volume of the American Gothic book. We talk about a lot of things, and he's got some great recommended books right at the end. If you enjoy the episode, please remember to like and spread the word as far and wide as you possibly can. Rate it on whichever podcast platform you use, review, share on Twitter, on Facebook, social media, all the way across. You can follow me on Twitter at what a twit, at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. And also, I'd like to plug, if I may, that we're about to start Pre-Code April, hashtag Pre-Code April, which is the month-long season of watching pre-code films with some great film enthusiasts, critics, writers, what have you. The person who you need to follow in order to get all the information on Twitter is Matthew Turner at FilmFan1971. At FilmFan1971. So follow him, click on the hashtag and find the lists of people and get involved. Watching pre-code films is amazing. Will open your eyes to a whole other dimension of cinema. If you haven't already been there, you're in for a treat. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
Well, way back in 1990, I had the idea to write a book about British horror films. And I think I got in contact with Peter Cushing and things like that. But that sort of didn't quite get off the ground for reasons too tedious to go into. In fact, I've forgotten most of them. But in 94, Marvel was starting up a new magazine called Hammer Horror. And the editor, Marcus Hearn, got in touch with a young actor, writer called Mark Gatiss, who was going to become very well known subsequently, and asked him to contribute to it. But because Mark and I had done a play not too long before, and he'd realized what a fellow Hammer fan I was, and horror fan generally, he said, no, it's not me you want, it's this guy. And he directed Marcus to me, which was very, very selfless of him. Mind you, he was writing lots of successful Edinburgh shows at the time, so maybe he just didn't have the time, but it was very, very generous and selfless of him. And as a result, I started writing for that magazine. At the same time, I started writing for a magazine here in the UK called Shivers, which is defunct now, but was going strong at the time. And so that's basically how it started in the 90s. And around about 96, I thought that idea about writing a book about British horror films, let's start that up again. And I did. And it came out in 2000. And, I sort of went on from there, if you like.
And so that first one was British Gothic.
Well, it was actually called English Gothic, and a few people have complained about the fact that it, strictly speaking, should have been called British Gothic. But in a rather indefensible way, I just felt that English Gothic has more of a poetic ring to it. I think it may be the clashing G's in there.
Ah, right, yeah, there's a little bit of internal alliteration. Yeah,
internal alliteration. Don't ask me why. It's a thing that I can't readily explain, but it has upset one or two people because, of course, I deal with Britain rather than just England.
Why did you sort of focus on the idea of the Gothic rather than, because you said you're writing a book of horror movies, but Gothic feels to me like it's a particular flavor or inflection that you want to strike?
Well, I think that's largely because I think I probably prefer the full-on Gothic mode, but I will happily hold up my hand and say that Gothic, and quite a few people have found this, Gothic is an awfully difficult concept to actually define. And I think in many ways it runs through the majority of horror films, really. And in the books, I don't make any real discrimination if a film strikes me as being a horror film. And of course, horror is such a hugely amorphous genre that there's a lot of disagreement even on that, never mind on something more specific like Gothic. If something strikes me as a horror film, I will write about it. I remember a lot of people of my generation were very influenced by a book that came out in 1973 by Dennis Gifford, which was called A Pictorial History of Horror Movies. And in that, he was very prescriptive in that. I mean, it's a very influential book, and people relished in particular all the wonderful illustrations. But he was very prescriptive. He insisted that he would only talk about films with some form of supernatural or science fiction material in them. And he actually expressly said, in other words, we will not be talking about films like Psycho. And I think if you exclude Psycho from the history of horror films, you're excluding a rather important kind of benchmark film, which, as it happens, despite being set in what was then contemporary America, is steeped in Gothic motifs, and yet is about, the sort of template slasher killer of modern times. So yes, I feel Gifford was a little too prescriptive there. So I try to, it's a very sort of a Catholic church, as it were. It's very widespread, and I try to embrace as much of it as seems to me to rate as horror.
And how did you first get this passion for horror then? What was it? Was there something that you watched kind of at an early age that imprinted you with this sort of lurid sort of passion?
That's perfectly true. I mean, I recently got an award. I think it may be my first. It was a rondo, and it was called a Monster Kid Hall of Fame.
Excellent.
And I thought, well, yes, I was delighted, but I was also slightly perplexed as a Brit because we didn't have this Monster Kid institution in the 60s and 70s, or rather, we had it, but we didn't know we had it. We didn't have anybody like Forrest J. Ackerman, who was editing Famous Monsters of Filmland. We didn't have anyone like him to tell us that we were monster kids. It was only later, in the early 70s, in my case, for instance, I wasn't, I didn't feel like a freak exactly, but it was nice later on to find out that there were loads of other young boys and girls relishing Dennis Gifford's book and other books of that period, suddenly you realize that you weren't alone. So there were monster kids, but it wasn't a kind of thing. I remember sort of my elder brother watched The Haunting on television with my father in, I think, 1972, and I wasn't allowed to watch. But he came back and told me how he was scared witless by that film, and that intrigued me. And later on, they watched the original Universal Frankenstein, and I sneaked a peek at that literally through the crack in the door frame, and I watched the opening scene, and I think maybe I was aware that my position was actually rather similar to that of Dwight Fry and Colin Clive in the film, where they're looking through the cemetery gates waiting for the funeral to finish. But I couldn't risk watching more than the prologue. So I don't know, I'm becoming very intrigued. In 1973, I was fascinated by horror films, but I still hadn't watched very many. I watched the Bela Lugosi Dracula, was fascinated by that. And then I'll try and cut a long story short.
No, make a short story long if you prefer. It's fine with me.
No, my father was quite keen on horror films too, would regale me with stories of going on business trips and dropping in to see Dracula, Prince of Darkness in, provincial cinemas and things. And I was fascinated by all this. And when Dracula Has Risen from the Grave was first shown on UK TV, in, I think, April 1974. It was a 6-year-old film, and of course, to a young boy at that time, that seemed like it was out of the ark. If a film was 6 years old, that's ancient history to an 11-year-old. But nevertheless, I was terribly excited. And he instituted something that would actually become a bit of a routine with us. He would put me to bed at 7 p.m., then he'd watch news at 10, and when news at 10 was over, he'd come upstairs, this is at 10:30 of course, and bring me down to watch Appointment with Fear, or whatever the strand was called, and the first of these was Dracula Has Risen from the Grave, and I was blown away by it. I was just the whole Gothic, if you like, ambiance of it, and the luridness of it, as you say, and also Christopher Lee's extraordinary power and presence as a kind of, the trademark demon lover, and particularly his death throes at the end. Actually, he's effectively killed twice in that film. He's staked, and then subsequently he falls onto a giant golden crucifix. And his physical acting in those scenes, for which I still to this day don't think he's given enough credit. His physical acting in that film, and sorry, we've just had the doorbell go.
That's good.
His physical, you can cut that bit if you like, can't you? His physical acting in that, just, I was sold. Let's put it like that. I was sold. And from that point on, I was wild about horror films and saw an unfeasibly large number at a possibly unhealthily young age. But that's okay. I've turned out all right, I think.
It's funny how horror is the only sort of film genre that it seems to pass by word of mouth really readily. If somebody tells me, oh, there's this film where this happens, I have to watch it, and it's always a horror film. It never happens with, nobody ever says, oh, there's this war film where they attack a castle on a cable car, and I think, oh, I've got to see that. I mean, I love Where Eagles Dare, but it's not, whereas somebody tells me, oh, there's a guy gets cut in half by a cable, it's like, oh, what's it called? Omen 2. Right, I've got to see that then. That's the,
well, that's a spectacular scene in that lift, yes, I must say. Oh, well, you're absolutely right. There is a very cultish fascination that has formed around horror films to a far greater degree than other genres. There was, I started out by writing for a magazine called Hammer Horror. As far as I'm aware, there has never been a magazine called Ealing Comedy. It's just horror does attract this cultish interest, which, of course, there are many, many, many wild and devoted fans of Ealing Comedy out there. I might even be one of them myself, but they do not get the same sort of momentum behind them if you like. It's an interesting phenomenon. Really.
Costume drama monthly.
No, you see, it's not going to happen, is it?
No, no, it's not. Unless there's a real gap in the market and just nobody's understood that. They're waiting for
possible.
20 pages supplements on Merchant Ivory. So how did you? So you said you watched an unfeasible number of horror movies, and this must be in the late 70s, early 80s. How are you getting these? Was this with the birth of the sort of VHS phenomenon, or?
Oh well, initially in the 70s, of course, one was dependent on what happened to be shown on television.
Right.
Which actually was quite a lot in those days. I happened to find a diary from 1975 recently, and it was effectively an appointments diary. But for the 12-year-old me, an appointments diary meant a list of which horror films I saw on which day. Right. And there were a lot. Of course, this was also in the latter part of the 70s, the BBC Two started doing these venerated horror double bills at the weekend, which, a bit like the Dennis Gifford book I mentioned, made a huge impact on a whole generation of young people. And, I think there are whole websites devoted to those BBC Two double bills with people, tabulating exactly what was shown on what day. Again, this is the strange lure of horror. And then, of course, yes, as you say, going into the 80s, VHS comes along and explosively, and so one's watching a lot that way. But of course, I also start going to see them at the cinema. I think we can admit this into the realm of horror. I certainly included it in English Gothic. There was a horror comedy film with Frankie Howard called The House in Nightmare Park, written by Terry Nation and Clive Exton, two very distinguished writers, and directed by Peter Sykes, who was a Hammer director, though this wasn't a Hammer film. And I actually saw that in the cinema that in 1973. That may have been the first. But subsequent to that, I remember films like Burnt Offerings, which was a Dan Curtis film, and
with Oliver Reed, I think.
With Oliver Reed and Karen Black and Betty Davis. That's right. And also some quite obscure items like Curtis Harrington's Ruby. I saw rather random horror movies in the cinema in the 70s. And then I think there may have been a time, actually, when VHS was really riding high. I was at university, and I think I went into a very odd phase, which I find inexplicable now. I was, passing into my early 20s, and I went through a very strange phase of sort of putting away childish things. Or imagining I was putting away
a dangerous phase. I've done that myself.
Have you?
Yeah, definitely sort of gone, my Star Wars figures are all going in a bag and I'm going to give them to a younger relative, and I'm not going to read science fiction anymore because I've discovered Jack Kerouac.
Exactly. Well, and it was also the period when, if you're at university, you're also a bit cash strapped. So you start to get rid of all your old LPs. And then, about 10 years later, you start to rebuy them because you realize what a terrible mistake that was. That kind of thing. I did that to a degree. But, if, for instance, and I remember this while I was at university, Frankenstein and the Monster from Hell comes on the telly. I was there. So it was still bubbling under, and yet on one sort of level, I very briefly, I wouldn't say I ever lost my interest in it, but my focus on it sort of wavered briefly. I didn't lose the interest exactly, but it ceased to be a kind of focus. And then I think I went to drama school after university. And I think it was at some point while at drama school that the interest came back. I know Christopher Lee, we're back on him now. Christopher Lee did a signing at Tower Records in Piccadilly in 1987 and actually ducked out of a rehearsal of The Seagull in order to go and have him sign my old 1970s photos of him. I apologize to all my old drama school friends. I did actually duck out of that rehearsal quite illegitimately. And so yes, I think while I was at university, the sort of focus wavered, but the interest was still there in a subterranean way. And then it came back. And of course, by 1990, as I said, I was actually planning a book on British horror films. So, I mean, obviously it had come back in earnest by then. And a curious process. I still don't quite understand that. putting away childish things. Why would one want to do that?
I know, but I there's a sort of feeling of immaturity that sort of and silliness that kind of sticks to them, and you think, no, this new stuff is much more serious. I'm going to listen to jazz instead of Pink Floyd, and then after a while you think, oh, I'm bored of jazz. I'm going to go back to Pink Floyd now, or I'm going to like both, which is of course the best.
That is the
best solution.
The best solution, yeah, absolutely. I think you realise that there's a power invested in it that spoke to you as a very young person, because you were very receptive to it as a boy or girl, and as a child, basically, you're very receptive to that power. And when you get to be sort of late teens or early 20s, you maybe want to put that aside. You sort of forget about the elemental power of it that spoke to you as a child, and then it just suddenly speaks to you again. And as you sort of devolve into your second childhood, as I suppose I am now, then the power is all the more, well, potent, put it that way.
Were you focused on English horror? Was that always a predilection, or was it just sort of, I'm going to do that for the book, just to sort of specialize in something?
No, not specifically. I loved horror from wherever I could get it, but I was very aware that I was brought up in Windsor, so apart from anything else, I was aware that a lot of in Windsor you're close to so many of the studios. But you're awfully close to Bray Studios. In fact, Bray Studios' address is Windsor.
Right.
And so, and I was aware that, up to 1966, the classic Hammer films were all made. The majority of them were all made at Bray Studios. And subsequently, they'd gone to Elstree and Pinewood. But even those were relatively, handy for Windsor. So because I was in that sort of film studio sort of nexus or district, I think maybe that may have contributed to the particular interest I had in British horror films. I think I was particularly interested in the fact that horror was such a sneered upon genre in Britain, particularly by the film establishment for so long. And yet it is so indivisibly British a thing. I mean, obviously it's not exclusively British, but Britain, Britain provided us with that little house party at the Villa Diodati in 1816. For a start, everybody trooped out from Britain to Switzerland to hatch Frankenstein and effectively Dracula indirectly at that house party. So, and it was very interesting that it was so. I think the screenwriter Stephen Volk, who's a friend of mine, is a lovely man, but he put it awfully well in the 90s when British horror was pretty much dead, and we'd switched back to the film establishment having no interest in it or time for it. He said, Gothic and horror generally is rooted in the soil here, and yet it's so hard to get anybody interested. I thought that was a fantastic quote. Rooted in the soil here, and yet so many people here aren't aware of that fact and just aren't interested. I think you've either got that horror gene, as it were, or you haven't. And I think for long stretches, the majority of the British film establishment, critical establishment generally, haven't had it. And like Stephen Volk, I puzzle over that because it is rooted in the soil here.
It's in so much of our TV as well. I mean, Doctor Who and all the, Terry Nation did Blake Seven. They always had this sort of macabre Quartermass, and I'm giving sort of science fiction-y examples, but they've always got Doctor Who used to terrify me.
Well, there's a huge crossover between horror and science fiction anyway, but Nigel Neal, the great screenwriter who hated to be stamped as a science fiction writer, he felt his stuff was about far more than, his stuff involved rockets and Martians from time to time, but nevertheless, he was trading in much more ancient things. He was also writing very contemporary stories, but the imagery was very, very ancient. I mean, the the Martians in Quatermass and the Pit are 5 million years old. And so he was trading in, very Gothic, if you like, motifs, and he was fusing that with science fiction. Now, that's a fantastic combination. And that's just another example of what I said. The genre is so vast, it takes in so much. And when I embarked on writing English Gothic, which was in 1996, well, given that it's had a couple of sequels, and I'm working on a third, by which I mean books with Gothic in the title, I didn't realize quite what I was embarking on. But also, of course, I didn't realize quite what I was embarking on in terms of the vastness of it. I mean, just British horror films alone is a huge territory, and it became even huger in the 21st century. After that period in the 90s that I mentioned, when nobody was interested, suddenly there were a few films that came out in 2002. 28 Days Later, I suppose, being the most well-remembered of them. And suddenly, I think British filmmakers became aware that horror was, amongst other things, very cheap. It's quite cheap to make, and of course, horror can often act as a kind of calling card, maybe for filmmakers who want to go on and do something else, or maybe for filmmakers who really do have that passion for horror. And there were several in the 21st century. And so suddenly, because I actually wrote a big addendum to English Gothic, and a new edition came out in 2015, which dealt with this huge outburst, this explosion of activity in the 21st century. And suddenly hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds more films were out there to consider. And so on that occasion, I was certainly aware of the scope of it. it was vast. Anyway, there we go.
David Putnam, I remember in an interview, actually said, I think this was during the 80s, he sort of said as advice to filmmakers, make a horror movie because it will teach you everything you need to know about making a film, and you can do it for cheap. And, very frequently it's kind of the twists and turns of a horror film are the special effects, if you like, and they're kind of cheap to do if you can do them well.
Well, that's very encouraging to hear that he said that. I'm not aware that he ever made a horror film. But correct me by all means if I'm wrong.
No, but, I'm trying to think, but no, I'm not sure. Chariots of Fire doesn't count, does it? No,
not quite. No, but great. No, I'm delighted that he said that. Yeah, and I think a lot of filmmakers have followed that lead. Yeah, make a horror film. It's a useful calling card if you do it well, of course. Because much as I love horror films, it would be silly not to admit that there's an awful lot of bad ones out there. But that's part of the thrill. You sort through the bad ones and you find the gems, don't you?
Yeah,
there are many, and there are many, many, many gems.
Yeah, the 90% of everything is shit sort of quote from Theodore Sturgeon, I think the science fiction writer, had Sturgeon's law.
Okay. Yeah. I wouldn't put it that high, but I believe in so.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Let's be a bit more generous than good old Theodore.
Indeed.
When you sort of widened out your scope from the already vast scope of the English Gothic, and you did the American and you did the European, did you do it in that order, or did you do European first?
No, you got me. No. Well, English Gothic came first. In 2007, American Gothic came out, and then in the middle of the last decade, I was writing Euro-Gothic, and at the same time, I wrote that expanded English Gothic.
Right. And
it had a big extra chunk nailed on the end. So that new English Gothic came out in 2015, and then Euro-Gothic itself finally came out in 2016. So the order, strictly speaking, was English, American, Euro. And I am now writing American Gothic 2.
Right.
Because, as some people have complained slightly, American Gothic ends just before Psycho, which struck me as a very useful cutoff point. And people have, I don't know that they're complaining exactly, but people have regretted the fact that it ends there. And my only response to that would be, have you not noticed how big and fat American Gothic is anyway? Going up to 1959, it would just be unfeasible to have written a longer book than that. which is why I am now writing American Gothic 2. And even that only goes up to 1985. It's only adding another 25 years because, of course, with Psycho as its sort of starting point, American horror went absolutely berserk. Of course it did, particularly in the 70s and 80s. So yes, I am finally writing American Gothic 2, which for various reasons has been taking quite a long time, but it will eventually come out for all those who are sorry that I finished in 1959.
Yeah, they must be clamoring for more because, of course, Psycho invents its own sort of subgenre as well.
Well, yes. I mean, it took time, I suppose. I mean, there were a lot. I mean, as soon as Psycho came out, any number of films influenced by it came out, of course. But it's looking at things very simplistically. The thing that then absolutely set the so-called slasher mode was Halloween. A good 18 years had elapsed. But it's very interesting seeing, that there was a huge amount of stuff actually filling in that gap between Psycho and Halloween and tending towards that Halloween moment, if you like. And then slasher films were omnipresent, and I think I was a little bit rude about slasher films in English Gothic. But the more you delve into the genre, the more you learn. And in researching American Gothic 2, I've gone back to an unfeasible number of slasher films, and I certainly find them a lot more interesting than I used to. But this is part of the process. You watch a film at a certain age, and you may not like it. You watch it again, maybe 20 years later, and you think, "My God, I was so blind. This is a fantastic film." And of course, the reverse can also be the case.
oh, heaven forfend.
You can adore a film in your teens, and you watch it 20 or 30 years later and think, "Oh my God, it just doesn't hold up, does it?" But this is the weird process that you go through in watching films.
I remember Highlander being like my Citizen Kane of films, and then rewatching it, like, "Oh my God, this is terrible trash." I mean, great fun, but
Oh, that's interesting, because I saw that at the time in the cinema, and I thought it was terrible. Maybe I should now rewatch Highlander, and I'll think it's brilliant.
Yeah, well, maybe you'll see me passing in the other direction.
Yes, exactly. Yes, absolutely.
At the midpoint. I was wondering, because you're watching so many of these films and reading Eurogothic, I don't consider myself in any way an expert or authority, but I've certainly watched a lot of European horror movies, and I was just like reading it with a notepad and writing down a list of over 100 films that I've got to see this, and I've got to see that, and I've got to see the do you still get scared by horror movies?
That's an interesting question. Not very often. Not very often. There comes a point when you've seen so many with modern horror films. Very often you're just aware of all the derivations, and there's nothing wrong with derivations. Obviously everything is built on a sort of system of derivations, because there are only so many stories. And but in a way that kind of takes you out of the film, because a little knowledge is a dangerous thing, if you like. So I think it is. I think what has always excited me about the horror genre, and maybe this amounts to being scared, I don't know, but I've always been aware of being thrilled by it, and thrilled by particular moments, just things that leap up and hit you. Whether that actually means that they're scaring you is a difficult one to quantify, but I do still get that feeling of being thrilled and excited. I mean, the films I saw in the 70s as a boy, for instance, Hammer films, I think the very early Hammer films, I think, scared the bejesus out of people at the time, because they'd never seen anything like them. But quite quickly they settled into a home counties Gothic mode that was almost welcoming. And and a pleasant place to be. But they're almost like adventure films, and I applied this to horror films generally as a boy because they excited me. I mean, there are moments in British horror films of that classic period, 50s, 60s, and early 70s, that just really thrilled me. To what degree I was ever scared, I don't know. I mean, for instance, I mentioned Quatermass in the Pit earlier.
Yes.
There's a scene at the end of that where the Martian intelligence actually assumes a kind of physical form, and yet it's a kind of ectoplasmic form, a sort of towering, devil-horned Martian image flickering over London, like a sort of giant hovering over all the terraced houses. And not Quatermass himself, but his associate, Professor Roney, Dr. Roney, I beg your pardon, is the self-sacrificing heroic guy who climbs to the top of a train and good God, I can't speak today. Who climbs to the top of a crane, climbs to the top of a crane and manipulates the crane into the terrible Martian image right into its face, and thus sort of neutralizes the image. He literally earths it, but of course he dies in the process. And that scene, particularly with Tristram Carey's electronic, strange, hard to describe synthesizer sounds underneath to indicate the rippling power of the Martian force, sort of sweeping over London and emanating from this ectoplasmic shape. And the sheer heroism of Dr. Roney, and a really rather good, I think, special effect from Les Bowie of the terrible Martian face in the sky. This thrilled me beyond words. It seemed to me to be a profound image, something very curious, and it really spoke to something.
Explaining football to the friend who's just there for the nachos? Hard. Tailgating from home like a pro with snacks and drinks everyone will love? An easy win. And with Instacart helping deliver the snack time MVPs to your door, you're ready for the game in as fast as 30 minutes. So you never miss a play or lose your seat on the couch or have to go head-to-head for the last chicken wing. Shop Game Day Faves on Instacart and enjoy $0 delivery fees on your first 3 grocery orders. Offer valid for a limited time. Other fees and terms apply.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous 2-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
Very, the whole point of that story is that 5 million-year-old Martians have had a huge impact on the human race. So there did seem to be something profound about this earthing of the Martian malevolence. And yet I watched that film recently with somebody who'd never seen it. Certainly never seen it as a child. And the scene made no particular impact on them at all.
Oh, how disappointing.
It's just, I suppose there comes a point, if you weren't exposed to these films at a young age, there comes a point where it's just another movie, There are so many movies to watch. And I think, so that particular, you say, are you still ever scared? I think I can be, but the actual thrill of it is something very connected to when you're a young person, because that's when you're most susceptible, I suppose. And that's why it's important not to put away childish things, because you need to keep that, if you like, childlike view in order to be thrilled. Let's try not to become too jaded. It can be an uphill struggle, but it's very important to retain that. And then if a film shows me something as thrilling, as profoundly thrilling as that Martian image in the sky, then I am quite capable of being thrilled again. Put it that way.
I mean, I love that way you describe the thrillingness of it and the fear factor as sort of almost separate things as well. Because I recently watched Dario Argento's opera, and the scene where a woman gets shot through the spy hole of her door, and it hits the telephone that someone else is trying to reach for. I just remember just being, that's the first time I watched it was like a few weeks ago, and just almost wanting to cheer because it was just such a thrillingly set up moment,
Yes, well, well, Argento has lots of moments like that.
Yeah, but the fear thing of horror has always stayed with me. I'm always scared of horror movies. I kind of can't. Some of them I can't really watch. I mean, I'll watch them and then I'll sort of fast forward to see where the killer is and rewind and then watch it knowing, okay, he's going to jump out of that door, because it would just disturb me so much. I mean, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, to this day, I find difficult to sit all the way through. I have to sort of get up and get a drink or something, pause it just so I can, I can't take it all at the same time.
Well, I must say, there's a new Texas Chainsaw Massacre out there now, isn't there? Which I haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I've watched it. It really fits in with your description of action movie.
Oh, does it?
Yeah, it's very much an action movie dressed up as a horror film.
That's interesting. Well, of course, it's attracted enormously polarized views, as everything seems to nowadays. Something's either absolutely brilliant or it's complete garbage. There doesn't seem to be any middle way nowadays. But it's on my list to watch. But the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is, in many ways, I think, the perfect horror film. I mean, that really is a horror film, and remarkably, it manages to be the ultimate horror film without, oddly enough, shedding all that much blood. Whereas the new one, I believe, is spectacularly gruesome. But the Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a horror film because I think what you were saying is it gets under your skin. I mean, the sort of fetid atmosphere of a Texan summer is so intense in that film. And the film is, I mean, you almost have to mop your brow watching the thing. And it's there's something fetid and ghastly about it, and it's brilliantly put together. And it is a film of real dread and unease. That's a very difficult thing to achieve, I think, in films, that feeling of actual dread. It also has those staggering moments that stay with you. We were talking about moments earlier. There's a moment when Leatherface suddenly flings aside a steel door, and there he is with a red wall behind him and various trophies on the wall, and he just bludgeons a young man with his mallet,
Yes.
And then flings the steel shutter back.
Yes.
And end of scene, and that is a real. I mean, you feel as if you've been hit with that hammer, don't you? It has that kind of impact, and that is a brilliant film. You're right; it's not for everyone, and it is quite a difficult film to sit through in many ways. But that is a grueling experience. Of course, we have to realize that a lot of people don't have the horror gene, for the simple reason they don't want to have grueling experiences. They want to have escapist experiences, which is great. We all do from time to time. But a lot of people, I do actually meet quite a few people who are just puzzled by the mere fact that one's interested in horror. Because why would you voluntarily make yourself uncomfortable? Just uncomfortable, never mind scared. Why would you put yourself through that? But this is all cod psychology stuff that's been hashed over many times. But there is a reason why a large number of people want to put themselves through that. It's a cathartic experience. Blah 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 blah. You experience the ghastly stuff that, if you're lucky, you will never experience in reality. But it is important to experience it in a fictional context. We've all heard those theories, and of course they're all fine, and they become cliches, but they become cliches for the very good reason that they're pretty much true. Some people just do not have that gene. It is just too unpleasant for them. The exciting quality of it that I mentioned just isn't there, and a film as grueling as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre would be just anathema to them. Even a relatively mild horror film might be anathema to them. That isn't a mild horror film. It's an extraordinarily clever and powerful film. It could well be the perfect horror film. I mean, how do you define that? It's impossible and it's absurd. I don't, respect to everybody who has asked me this, but I've many times been asked, what is your favorite horror film? And I must say, I don't care for that question because it's impossible to answer. I mean, quite apart from anything else, you might come out with an answer and next week you'd come out with an entirely different answer. If you've seen enough horror films, you've got an awful lot of favorites because, as I say, quite a lot of them are bad, but even the bad ones can be very diverting. But there's an awful lot of good ones. And so what is your favorite horror film is very, very difficult question for me to answer.
I think it's funny that idea because I heard a lot of people on Twitter and I think it's a legitimate point that there's a lot of snobbery against horror, but I also know that like my daughter, who's really into her films, just turned around to me the other day and said, you know what, I don't think I want to watch horror movies. I don't think I like them anymore. I don't like being scared. So there is that, and I find my own personal sort of, there are certain, like I really like Fulci, his films. But my problem with them is they just disgust me too much. And there's a point, so I can admire them and I can sort of see what they're doing. But all the wiggly worms and maggots and stuff just makes me feel ill. And it's like, do I really want to watch this before dinner?
Well, I think Fulci may well have taken that as an affirmation. I mean, I think he was perfecting a sort of little corner of the genre all his own, and those emetic effects, some of which don't actually hold up too well when viewed now. I think in particular of there's a bunch of clockwork tarantulas, I think, in the Beyond that feast on somebody's face as. What else would they do in a Fulci film? But I seem to remember that effect actually doesn't look so great anymore. But no, Fulci's films are, well, I guess they're an acquired taste. But if you're in the mood, if you're in the vein, as it were, then you couldn't better him. Fulci made the best Lucio Fulci films of that type of anybody because they were his films, and you're right. Disgust was an important feature of them, but at the same time, he actually, as where atmosphere was concerned, there was quite a lot of poetry in them. So, and he said himself he wasn't aware where this strange atmosphere came from. It just sort of arrives, and of course it makes those films a very potent and slightly perplexing mixture of those horrendous, gross out moments with brains and worms and God knows what sploshing all over the place. But there are these weirdly atmospheric, poetic moments. So, yeah, his films are fascinating on that level.
Yeah, you go back to that comfort that you were talking about earlier of, we kind of like our misty graveyards and, candelabras and whatnot.
We do. Well, I do. And I just, the classic costume Gothic thing. Of course, in the last 20 years, there've been a few instances of people trying to revive that mode, or at any rate making a film in that mode, but they are very few and far between. There seems to be a distrust of that costume Gothic thing. I guess modern audiences fancying themselves sophisticated, the myth of sophistication, as I call it, just imagine that stuff is camp. It's just camp. I can't stand the word camp, and I particularly can't stand the American variation on it, campy. The reason I can't stand it because it seems to me to be applied very often by people who don't know what camp actually means. And they apply it so often to films that are not camp at all. They just apply them to films that they find laughable, which I think is a slightly different kettle of fish. But that again is to do with the snobbery directed at horror films. But it does mean that it is very difficult to make a costume Gothic film these days, and it'd be nice if somehow that particular subgenre could be revived, but we shall see. Following
the sort of doldrums of the 90s when the horror wasn't being made in quite the numbers that it had been. We're sort of living through something of a golden age, not just in terms of British horror, but also with horror coming from all over the world. I'm thinking of the Japanese horror films that started coming out. The Korean started arriving as well. And much more sort of knowledge of the Italians and the Europeans as well. Do you? I mean, looking at the sort of rude health of horror at the moment, that must be something that you're thinking, I've got another 4 or 5 books here.
Well, what's particularly, but yes, you're right. Horror from all corners of the globe, and starting, in the late 90s when all those fabulously effective Japanese horror films started arriving outside Japan. And what's very exciting is the fact that there seems to be a huge appetite now for horror wherever it happens to come from. And of course, the very exciting thing now really is the preponderance of horror on television. It's really remarkable. And I think it shows, that it's sort of people's desire to be spooked or maybe occasionally repulsed, but certainly scared. It's being transplanted into a different arena. Interestingly, it's being transplanted directly into people's sitting rooms. But nevertheless, you're right. It shows that horror is in a kind of rude health. Maybe the snobbery that I mentioned is actually ebbing away. And there have been signs that it's ebbing away, but that kind of snobbery never quite goes away. There was a time when, going back to British horror films, there was a time when British horror films were looked down upon within the profession. Peter Cushing was always very happy to be in horror films. As he said, who wants to see me play Hamlet? Very few. But millions want to see me play Frankenstein, so that's the one I do. Now, his frequent co-star Christopher Lee had a very different view. He was actually quite defensive about horror films, he would, and the actor doth protest too much. He did actually go on with the defensive stuff a bit too much. But we can see why, because within his own profession there was this kind of condescension and snobbery, and actors very often would sneak out to make a film at Bray or whatever without telling their loved ones, or certainly not without telling their friends in the profession. It's an extraordinary kind of snobbery, and it makes me laugh now because my definition of schlocky nonsense and rubbish is something like Downton Abbey. And yet, of course, I know Downton Abbey is now, well, they're making feature films from it, aren't they? But yeah, the actual series is now a thing of the past. But when Downton Abbey was current, I thought, British actors are falling over themselves to appear in this garbage. So, which is...
that needed a good chainsaw massacre right there.
And yet there's no snobbery attached to that. And yet back in the 60s, if you went down to Bray or Shepperton to make a Hammer or Amicus film, actors very often would keep quiet about it. Just ridiculous to me. But that's it. I think, snobbery exists the world over, obviously, but I don't think this is a very revolutionary thought. The British are particularly good at it in all walks of life.
When The Shining, Stanley Kubrick was directing The Shining, I remember there was a critical reception which very much sort of explicitly said, why is this guy wasting his time on a Stephen King novel?
Oh, you get that all the time. Yeah. Of course you do. And for the same reason, whenever a vaguely, kind of high echelon director does stoop to do a horror film, it doesn't happen so often now, but there was a time when it always happened. Whenever somebody did that, a reasonably top flight director stooped to make a horror film, they would, of course, assure you that it wasn't a horror film. You see it in interview after interview, and the contortions they would get into to actually put a different label on it.
It's actually Greek tragedy.
Yeah, well, of course, psychological thriller is very helpful, or even an inquiry into the into the spiritual. Who knows what? But God, heaven forfend that you would stamp my film as a horror film. And of course, you then toddle along and see the thing, and of course, it's a bloody horror film. What else is it? But that degree of self-delusion is almost touching, I think.
There's a film director I talked to a year or so ago. He made Host, the film, the Rob Savage, and he's funny because he did it the other way around. He started, I think he was very young, 19, 20, and he released a film which was very much an indie social realist film. And when they came and said, what do you want to do now? It was like, I want to do the films I really like, which are horror movies. So his calling card was the serious film, and his career path is entirely aimed at horror.
Well, hats off. Hats off to that. Oh, that's great. Yes. Yes. Get in there by stealth, sort of wrong foot people by making a worthy film. I'm sure his film was very good, but and then, well, what I actually want to make are horror movies. I like that. That's great. That's a good way around. I like it. Anyway, but I mean, I think horror is in rude health, and that snobbery, it hasn't gone, but it's certainly in abeyance, put it that way.
Do you have a line that do you get, are there ever a film where you, in terms of the gore and in terms of that sort of aspect, is there ever a film where you think, oh God, I wish I could unsee that? Or even maybe from a point of view, I'm thinking, for some reason, I'm always thinking of the Italian movies, something like Cannibal Holocaust, where there's some sort of political element beyond what you're seeing on the screen, such as the animal cruelty or the misogyny of some films that you think, I wish I hadn't seen that.
Well, I knew you were going to mention Cannibal Holocaust as soon as you talked about stuff that you would prefer to unsee. Well, Cannibal Holocaust, in terms of animal cruelty, is a very specific case, and happily there aren't many like it. But yes, that is a superb film, actually. It's an enormously powerful film. But it's very definitely the kind of film you don't need to see again. And a few years ago, I met the director, who was delightful. I think this often surprises people, doesn't it? The people who make the nastiest films are often the sweetest people. Deodato, yes, he was a delight. But that's an enormously powerful film. But again, I mean, it really isn't for everybody. There are scenes in that are kind of inexcusable, aren't there? Where that's concerned. And where misogyny is concerned, yes, you can't escape it in some genre films. It's very, the older you get and the more queasy it makes me feel, some of that stuff. I'm happy to say that the general view that horror is sort of inherently misogynistic is not one that I share. But when you do see it, and it does turn up quite often, well, not quite often, but it does turn up sometimes. And when you do see it, and it's just so blatant, it is queasy stuff. And those aren't films that I much care for. And as you say, they're kind of watch it once, and certain items, certain features of those films, you're right, you wish you could unsee them. But there are certain films, where you can't escape. You can't escape from the fact that there is a misogynist impulse there. I mean, even in some quite apparently innocuous production line British films of the early 70s, there was a kind of, I think because the censorship pendulum has so completely swung. Obviously, when censorship pendulums completely swing, people are going to go too far initially, I think, and then this pendulum will slowly swing back to a more middling place. But even in jolly old Britain in the early 70s, you get the impression, where some films are predicated on rape, quite often, you get the impression that there's an awful lot of bottled up frustration from male filmmakers here. But because censorship has now relaxed, we can now take our revenge in some way. I realize that sounds a little baroque, but you do get that impression from some films, and it's not pleasant. But there you go. I don't think it is absolutely endemic to horror as a genre, though, which I would take issue with that idea.
Yeah, no, I think you're.
I know you're not saying that, but I think some people do.
Sure, no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right as well, though, that at the end of the 70s, even in American film, it was almost illegal not to have rape scenes of sort of stunning ambivalence, it's really
The
head
ambivalence.
scratch. I mean, Sergio Leone has horrible rape scenes in Once Upon a Time in America, for instance, which are make me feel very queasy, because I'm not entirely sure where the camera is, where it's, what the attitude is.
Yes, yes. Where is the filmmaker coming from? And of course, you could be doing the filmmaker a disservice, but you can only respond to the film, through your own eyes. And if you feel it's coming from a bad place, then it makes it an unpleasant film to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the other things that I noticed in reading Euro Gothic, I love the thing about the comedies as well, because I think that's if there's a snobbery against horror movies, there's a double snobbery against sort of horror comedies. And I was legitimately both terrified and amused by Carry On Screaming as a child. So it has a place in my heart, that sort of subgenre.
Well, do you mean there's a snobbery against horror comedies from horror fans because they prefer their horror straight, or do you mean the general populace?
I mean, I can think of some amazing horror comedies like Young Frankenstein and Shaun of the Dead, which have been, wildly celebrated. Fearless Vampire Killers by Polanski, perhaps, as well. But a lot of those, I don't know. I sort of, maybe from the horror fraternity as well, as like, this is just pantomiming what we like.
Well, I think horror is a very difficult genre to get right. As we discussed, it's an easy genre to do because you can do it relatively cheaply, but to get it right, it's very difficult. And in a way, I think horror comedy is even more difficult, because horror and comedy, they're actually very similar commodities in many ways. And again, this is a cliche, the impulse to scream and the impulse to laugh. I believe physiologically, they're actually very similar. And of course, we're aware that when people scream in a cinema, they will often all collectively laugh directly afterwards as a release, and sort of, oh gosh, aren't we silly? And collectively, we kind of, have that sense of it. So laughter and screaming are very, closely knit. But when you actually deliberately go out to cultivate comedy as well as horror in a film, it's weird, because they are analogous things in a way, but they're so difficult to literally put together, because you end up either with a film that's funny. You generally don't end up with a film that's both funny and scary, and you almost never end up with a film that's just scary. I mean, a film that was just scary rather than any way comic would be a complete failure if comedy horror was what you were aiming for. But it's very difficult to put them together. I mean, it's much easier, because it's a parody is also a difficult genre, but it is easy, I think, to get laughs from horror, but to also be quite scary at the same time, I think that's difficult. I mean, the film I mentioned earlier, The House in Nightmare Park, it's a Frankie Howerd film, but it is actually quite scary, and it has a sort of Pierrot dance by a middle-aged family playing clockwork dolls, effectively, which is one of the freakiest and weirdest things you'll ever see. So I think it can be done, but it is awfully difficult. It's a very nice subgenre, but very difficult to do. I mean, Carry On Screaming, for example. Carry On Screaming doesn't have any ambition to actually frighten you, does it? I mean, it's a carry-on film.
Yeah, but those guys, for some reason, the fact that the guy with the blocked heads, those two, I don't know what it was, but they scared them. I mean, I must have been like 7 or 8 years old when I saw it, but.
Well, this is it, you see. You can never actually tell. We're going back to discovering these things as children, but you can never actually tell what's going to frighten people. To the very young mind, yes, Odd Bod Senior and Odd Bod Junior, I can well see why you'd be deeply disturbed by them. Yeah, absolutely. But I don't think Carry On Screaming is not an example of a film that wants to be scary.
No, right.
As well as comic, because after all, it's a carry-on film. It's an out-and-out comedy. But a byproduct of that can still be you being freaked out as a child. Yeah, absolutely. I can well see why.
Emotionally scarred for life.
Well, I hope it's not that bad. Anyway, so there you go.
So I want to ask you a final question, which is, would you be able to give us a film book recommendation, somewhere, point us in a direction of a film book that you have read and has, gripped you or influenced you or inspired you or anything really, or you just like?
I can give you a couple. There's a relatively old one now by David J. Scarl called Hollywood Gothic. That's another of those films in Gothic in the title, but not written by me. In fact, preceding all my books. And that is, that's actually quite a specific focus in there. That's about the progress of Dracula from a novel to getting onto the screen. So it goes through Nosferatu and this 1920s stage play right through to the Universal film made in 1930. And so that's quite a forensic examination of a fairly small sort of area. And that's a great book, I think. And David Scarl has written loads of great stuff, but that's one that had a particular impact on me. For an extraordinary book, I think, is a book by Kayla Janice called House of Psychotic Women, which is about a much wider topic. Well, the title is borrowed from the English release title of a Spanish horror film, but House of Psychotic Women tells you all you need to know, I suppose. But the fascinating thing about that film, it was a trailblazer in that Kayla Janice looks at films through a kind of autobiographical lens, and it was a highly unusual and very striking book in that she has that autobiographical thing running alongside very penetrating analyses of a wide range of films. So where Scarl is looking at a fairly smallish corner, if you like, Kayla Janice that's an extraordinary book. There's an awful lot of horror books actually that I've enjoyed, I think. But I think those two might be worth. Yeah, I think they're definitely might be worth featuring on your program. They're certainly heartily recommended. Put it that way.
Jonathan, thank you so much for speaking to me. Brilliant books, and I'm so looking forward to the second volume of American Gothic.
Well, I'm looking forward to finishing the thing, quite frankly. But it will be, and it could well be out relatively soon. We'll see.
Excellent. You'll have to come back and talk about it when you've finished.
Oh, happy to.
So that was our conversation. I hope you enjoyed it. I get very aware that I keep saying the same things time and time again in these intros and outros. But hopefully everybody has turned off as soon as the interview is over, so you don't have to listen to and put up with this sort of rambling, innocuous series of phrases that I keep coming up with. Things like, enjoy the conversation, and thanks go to Elliot Atkins for the music and Ali Howard for the artwork. But of course, thanks do go to Elliot Atkins for the music and Ali Howard for the artwork. One other thing I mentioned at the top was Pre-Code April. I think that's a great initiative and a great way of adding some films to your watch list that you might not ordinarily encounter, and it gives you a sort of refreshing idea of how Hollywood developed. So I would very much recommend that you do that. Also mentioned that I recently watched Nightmare Alley, the Guillermo del Toro film, the remake of a film noir, I think from the 40s. It's got to be Tyrone Power in the lead. I really enjoyed Nightmare Alley. I really rated it. It looks beautiful. It looks brilliant, which is true of all Del Toro's films. But previous to this one, I've always found his films kind of fall down somewhere along the line. They sort of feel like they were a really good idea, but for some reason, I don't know what it is. They're just, the ideas are almost too apparent, you know? They're almost, I can see what the storyboards looked like and what the script looked like rather than see the film itself. Nightmare Alley feels utterly different and a real step up, I think. For instance, I wasn't particularly keen on Shape of Water. I mean, I admired it. There was nothing wrong with it in particular, but it just felt like it was, as soon as you realised what it was trying to do, it then just became, well, very predictable. I could see all the way through it. This film is not exactly sort of twisty-turny. I mean, being a film noir, there's an element of inevitability, sorry, I'm trying to be too clever there, inevitability to what is going to happen. So it's not a case of like, oh wow, the protagonist doesn't end up in a particularly good place. That's a shocker. But that doom is a journey, a sliding journey, which is really interesting. And Bradley Cooper, what an interesting actor. He does so much in this film. He has such a range in this film. And he manages to pull off that sort of, he's an enigma, but we kind of know who he is at the same time. Very, very well. And I was really impressed. And not to just pick out Bradley Cooper, but the whole cast here is so deep. Even bit parts are being played by actors of the quality of Willem Dafoe, and that goes all the way through the cast. That goes all the way through the movie. It's not just one or two, it's like 6 or 7. Absolutely amazing. Toni Collette, for instance. Mara Rooney's really good. Just highly recommended. I mean, I don't usually do little film reviews at the end of these podcasts, but you know, tape is cheap, so I thought I'd talk about that. Okay, great. So I've already thanked Elliot and Ali, and I don't feel the need to do so again, because that would actually be 3 times that I've said those words, and that would be really putting a little bit too much. I would be asking a little bit too much of the listener to put up with. So the last thanks goes to the listener. Thanks for joining me. And next week I'll be talking to Kim Newman, author of Nightmare Movies, the Anno Dracula books, and his latest book about Raymond Chandler and Boris Karloff, Something More Than Night. So until then, take care.
Shorter days and chillier nights can make it tough to keep up your fall workout routine. Thankfully, there's Alo Moves, the app that brings health and wellness to the comfort of your home. Alo Moves offers yoga, Pilates, strength workouts, and other fitness classes, plus wellness offerings like meditations, sound baths, and more. Whether you have 5 minutes or an hour, Alo Moves has a class or flow that saves you from a frigid trip to the gym. Get a 30-day free trial and 20% off an annual membership with code ACAST at alomoves.com.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
My dad works in B2B marketing. He came by my school for career day and said he was a big ROAS man. Then he told everyone how much he loved calculating his return on ad spend. My friends still laugh at me to this day.
Not everyone gets B2B, but with LinkedIn, you'll be able to reach people who do. Get a $100 credit on your next ad campaign. Go to linkedin.com/results to claim your credit. That's linkedin.com/results. Terms and conditions apply. LinkedIn, the place to be, to be.